Welcome to Shaping the NYC Skyline, the podcast that explores the stories behind the buildings that shape our city. I'm your host, David Shamshovich, and I'm here with my co-host,
Brenda Slukowski.
Welcome, Skyliners.
Hey, Skyliners.
Hi, everyone.
The guest of this podcast. I'm afraid to say his name, but I'll say it anyway.
It's not like Beetlejuice.
I will say I was very intimidated.
He's fun. He's funny. He's interesting. He was so excited to be here. He was the most excited guest to be here.
I think so.
As far as I can tell. And we were so happy to have him. We were both thanking each other for like an hour, like a Jewish goodbye. But thank you. No, thank you. No, thank you. Eliot Spitzer.
Eliot
the former
Spitzer.
governor.
The one and only.
Former Attorney General of the state of New York.
I really enjoyed his conversation. Not only did we get an insight into his life and his trajectory and how he made it into the real estate business, but you could hear in his voice his passion for the law, the fact that he's dabbled in so many different types of law, in litigation and in his M&A work, in the white collar defense. He's really run the gamut, and he's made it into a position in his life that he feels so strongly about and has contributed to New York City in multiple ways, not just in cleaning up crime, but now in shaping the New York City skyline.
He was shaping the New York City skyline before it was cool, right? Because maybe he wasn't shaping it from a real estate developer perspective, but he was shaping it in terms of crime fighting, environmental, organized crime.
He took a lot of pride in his work, and you can hear it in his voice and the way he speaks about it, the way that he cares for the city and the pride that he has in just doing what's right and being an advocate for the state of New York.
And his honesty.
Yeah.
He likes to be honest now that he's not a politician anymore because he can say things without the repercussions.
But yet you can still see the politician in him when he's giving his opinion.
Yeah. You can take the politician out of the man, but you can't take the man out of the politician. Something like that.
One of those.
There's a phrase.
Yeah.
I think that's part of his personality. I don't think you can give that up.
And it's interesting to see how humble he is, how much credit he gives to everybody else, even though he is that politician. You normally would put a politician in a stereotypical box of he's egotistical, he wants XYZ, he's so inflated. But Eliot's so down to earth. He gives credit where credit is due. He surrounds himself with the people who are best for the job and really takes pride in the people that he leads.
Yeah, he seems to really enjoy the things that he's doing, and he's settling into those things. And perhaps, the past is a politician. It's a different chapter. As he said, I like his view. He's going to discuss this. You're going to hear about it. But his view is life is about different chapters in a book. And when one chapter's done, you move to another. And sometimes those chapters are forced endings. Sometimes they're ones that you see that are ending. But it's a new chapter. It doesn't seem to hold any grudge in connection with any of those chapters, the ending and beginning. Looks like he's happy. He's making the best of the things. He's a grandpa now, enjoying his grandkid and one on the way. And he seems to really like having taken over the business that his father started in the 1950s.
I like to see his perspective because he finds such emotionally rewarding aspects to each chapter of his life. He's found the emotional reward in cleaning up the city of crime, emotional reward of getting involved in his dad's business and revitalizing the city and taking the properties that they had or new properties and really creating something beautiful for the skyline.
Yeah. Well, we really enjoyed talking to Eliot. So happy to have him come in, and he was so lovely, so nice.
And I think
so open.
You're really going to enjoy him as well.
I think so too.
That's right. So Skyliners, put your seats in their upright positions.
Fold your tray tables.
Whatever it is that you do to get ready to take off.
Without further ado, Mr. Eliot Spitzer,
the governor.
Hello, Skyliners.
Hello there, Skyliners. And hello to Brenda and Camilla as well.
Hey, David. Hey, Camilla.
Hi, David. I'm Brenda.
Now that we've gotten all of the particulars out of the way, all of those,
How's your day
niceties. My day is just about to get better.
Just
actually.
about.
That leads me exactly to where I was going.
You're welcome.
Well, I appreciate it. That's why we're here together to make sure that we're doing the things that we need to do to get our job done. And right now, our job
Damn
is
right.
to talk about a man who's sitting in front of me, who I'm shaking actually right now, just thinking about it. A
We all
man
are.
who has done a lot of great, amazing things for the city, and he continues to do so to this very day. He's prosecuted mobsters. He's been the governor. He was a state attorney general. He was in private practice. And now he's developing and shaping the NYC skyline. I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Eliot Spitzer.
Well, wow. Best applause I've gotten in years. That was very nice. Thank you.
Well, it's because you're not on Broadway.
Right.
Actually,
I wish I were.
One-man show. What do you...
My kids don't think I'm funny. I try.
Whose kids think that they're funny?
Kids never
That is
think
true.
their parents
Nor
are
does my
funny.
spouse, so that's all right. But I do. I laugh at all my jokes.
My wife used to think I was funny. Maybe it's because I just make the same jokes over and over again, but
That's probably the reason.
That's
and
nice.
you
of
don't even get a pity laugh, I'm sure.
No. I just get told to go somewhere else.
Yeah, but now the grandkids are growing up and it's a whole new audience for those
My sense of
jokes.
humor is not appropriate for them.
Okay, give it a little bit
Well,
of time.
how many grandkids?
Only one. Second on the way.
Oh.
It is awesome. It really is pure joy.
Is it the second grandchild coming from the same child?
Same. I have 3 daughters. My oldest daughter has baby Rowan on December 1 of 19 months ago, 20 months ago. And number 2 is in the offing. So I'm very excited.
So cute.
Very excited.
That's
That
fine.
is very
Do we know? Or if you can.
We do. I'm not sure I'm allowed to say
No,
it
yeah, that's
publicly,
okay. Don't.
but
That's
it
okay.
is, it's good. Great.
That's very
Our agenda is
exciting.
not to get you in trouble here. Well, let's get right into it.
Okay.
So you graduated from some lame school called Harvard.
Barely.
Barely.
I got a diploma. As they say, what is the last person in the law school class called?
Right.
A lawyer.
A lawyer. I was
Actually,
about to
look,
make that joke.
I was on law review. I did okay. I read a few cases.
And in Princeton, you went to the School of Public and International Affairs, which I assume public policy was something that you were interested in
It's
back
interesting.
then.
It was called the Woodrow Wilson School back then. This shows you how things change over time. Woodrow Wilson was the president of Princeton and president of the United States. And now they've taken his name off the school because he held views that we would properly view as abhorrent. And yet, I don't want to say we're commonplace when he held them. He was still a bit of an outlier and slow to move on issues of racial discrimination. And yet names are taken off because of that, quite properly. But it is interesting to see how our values do change. It poses the difficult question, which is that if there's progress, as we hope there is, by definition, things we believe today will be rejected 50 years from now, 100 years from now, and will be viewed as being, if not abhorrent, certainly out of date and unacceptable, right? That's the nature of progress in terms of moral beliefs. So in a way, today we're doing things that a century from now, they will look at us and say, how did you do that? And I asked my kids and their friends a question at one point where they were over and we were debating this issue of statues and names being taken off. I said, what do you think it is we're doing today that maybe 100 years from now, somebody will say it's inconceivable that we would even think about that? Is it eating meat? Is it polluting the air? Is it something that is just part of day-to-day society that will change in terms of its moral structure?
I hope it's the polluting them.
Well, look, that's
I hope
right.
it's that one.
Issues of global warming that were not
Yeah.
understood
Yeah.
many years ago. Not to go toot my own horn, but when we made the first coal cases when I was Attorney General, I think it was 1999 or 2000, we sued all the coal companies in the Midwest that were polluting, they were violating the Clean Air Act. But I made the point when we announced the cases that global warming, which was a new issue, was something we had to think about. And we showed a picture of the polar ice caps beginning to recede. And at the time, it was like, wow, what's that? What's going on here? Now, of course, it is accepted. And read the papers about the warmth of the oceans, hotter than they've ever been. The ice caps are really disappearing. I mean, the climate issues are severe.
I know that you're friendly with or have been friends with or still are friends with Al Gore,
Right.
who's
Yep.
the inventor of climate change.
Yes. Well,
but the one that made it more into the popular knowledge
Yep.
or mainstream knowledge
Yes.
with his documentary.
he is a remarkable guy, and he lost. Well, it depends, not to play Donald Trump, but maybe he won that election, right? We're not in the business of doubting outcomes. Although I will say, as a lawyering matter, I think one of the worst Supreme Court decisions of the modern era is Bush v. Gore, when the Supreme Court 5-4 gave it to George W. Bush. in an opinion, which they said themselves should not be cited for anything because they knew it was kind of sui generis. Put that aside. Al Gore was prescient on this issue. And he was unfortunately mocked by many people who said, oh, what's he talking about? Typical East Coaster or West Coast. He was way ahead of the curve, understood the impact that climate change would have and the existential threat that it poses to not only humanity, but to many, many species on the earth. And so he deserves a lot of credit for that. And he was a very smart, thoughtful, good person, still is.
Yeah.
And, people would make fun of him because he wasn't as comfortable on TV. He was a good person with great values and a very good government official.
And it's funny that they did make fun of him. I know the South Park guys did a very funny, and then they had to apologize because they're like, actually, you were right.
Right.
Yeah. Turns out he was. So.
I told you so is the best form of revenge, right? When somebody has to come back and tell you you were right.
Yeah, exactly.
So do you know, what is it that drove you to go to law school in the first place?
Very easy. Given my heritage, you'd have to be a doctor or a lawyer. And my sister got a nosebleed one day. I saw blood. I passed out. I said, well, that takes that off the list. I got to be a lawyer. And there it was.
That's how I became a lawyer. I was almost a nurse. And then I took one chem class and I went, no, thank you. Yep. And here we are.
So everything made sense after that.
So your story is just like mine. We have a very similar story then. Yes, I too, in my Jewish household, it's a doctor, a lawyer, and your brother and sister are both, your brother's a neurosurgeon.
Doctor and lawyer.
My brother did not pass out when he saw blood. He became a neurosurgeon. My sister, I don't know why she became a lawyer. No, she's my older sister. I can still say that. And so she was a lawyer, practiced for many years. But the law, to be more serious, it was not because I wanted necessarily to be a private sector lawyer, but I somehow had a sense that the law was that piece of our social fabric that distinguished us from other civilizations. And it was the respect for the law that permitted us to differentiate ourselves from authoritarian regimes, from fascism, from all the isms that were a threat to culture and society. And one of the great concerns I have about our society today is that we are losing that respect for the law and that we are losing that differentiation from ourselves that permits us to say the rule of law means something special here that it does not mean elsewhere in the world.
Do you have a sense? I have a sense as to my understanding, but why do you think that is? Why do you think that they're losing that? The society now is not as respectful of rules.
Well, I'd be interested to hear what you think. I don't know. I have this conversation with my friends, and I wish I had a clear answer. Some of the political polarization clearly has led to the denigration of the law. Now, which comes first is my question. Does political polarization come because we've lost respect for the societal rules, or vice versa? Has the law become politicized? We have criminalized politics, which is a dangerous thing, even though there's no question in my mind that Donald Trump has violated multiple laws through many periods of his life, as anybody in the real estate industry would probably know. But I don't like to see politics descending into those who lose get indicted, get prosecuted, because then politics, which should be within the law but not be lead to criminal investigation every time, is being denigrated as well.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. But to sort of dispute that point as well, when the people in power do things, at least in the modern era, that society has not seen before, like attempt to overthrow the president and the government.
Put him aside. I think the descent into the criminalization of politics began at an earlier point when we saw the impeachment of Bill Clinton. We saw the other criminal investigations that ran rampant around people in politics, as though that was an acceptable means of political dispute. And it's too bad.
Yeah, I think that's right. Using that as a weapon to try to attack even the smallest of digressions because they can.
Right.
And they have the ability to do that.
Correct. It degrades politics.
So it's unfortunate. At least you had good intentions when coming into the law. And also then you actually did a lot of good. And I want to transition into that. But first, I want to talk about your clerkship with Judge Sweet in the Southern District of New York. Is that something that you wanted? Did it?
Oh, it was great. I mean, when I was in law school, and not to make fun of it, I did well enough. There was a certain career path back then. If you did well in law school, you were on law review, then you got a clerkship. Right. And I wanted to clerk in the district court because that's where there was more energy day to day. Appellate clerkships were more like being on law review, where you sat in the library, you researched, you wrote footnotes, and we had trials in front of us. We got to see some of the great New York litigators. Judge Sweet himself was a very energetic and fun individual. He'd been a deputy mayor under John Lindsay here in New York City. He had been a partner at Skadden Arps. He loved both the law and politics and understood the real life impact of his decision making. So it was great. It was a year when I remember being absolutely terrified the first day you walk into chambers and the judge, there'd been a motion argued the week before, and he took the papers, the motion for summary judgment, in some case, took them through on my desk and said, write an opinion. I said, I don't know how to do that. He said, now you do. And you wrote. And it was like, whoa, you're in law school. You think there's something mythical. There's something remarkable about all these opinions. Then you realize, it's some clerk somewhere just schlubbing it out. So, we wrote opinions on all these issues, archaic issues. And, because we were a district court, everything from admiralty to I remember I wrote one opinion about repos, reverse swaps. And this is 1985, and before swaps became commonplace in the financial markets. And I think it's fair to say that I understood the case for the 10 seconds that it took me to write the dispositive paragraph. The judge looked at me when he was about to sign it and said, are you sure about this? I said, I have no idea.
And then he went, okay.
He signed it. We all held our breath and said, nobody appealed it. So we said, okay, we're safe. But we had to pretend to be an expert in the vast array of the law that was out there. But it was great fun.
No, I had the same experience, and you're right. It was a lot of fun. I'm not sure if you had an intention on being a litigator right after that, or is that just sort of how it progressed?
I think I did. I think almost because when I was younger, I didn't quite appreciate what corporate lawyers did. Obviously, they're more than litigators or corporate lawyers, but as a kid, what you think of as lawyering is being a litigator. The movies, right? You see somebody in front of a jury box pounding the table, doing whatever they're doing.
Giving an empathic speech to the jury. Right,
that's what lawyers do. You don't see somebody sitting in their office thinking about subclause 12X, about what happens if they default on the swap. Okay. So, yes, being a litigator was kind of how I envisioned it. And so I went from there to Paul Weiss for a year, where being a private sector litigator was fun. And it was primarily the first wave of big M&A litigation, when M&A work was exploding exponentially in terms of scale. But initially, it was just Paul Weiss and Skadden Arps that did most of that work, and most of the white shoe firms somehow didn't think it was appropriate. Then they looked at the billable hours and they said, now it's appropriate. And they said, we can make a bloody fortune on this. And it was great. So I worked with some of the top litigators in the city, Arthur Lyman, Max Gitter. It was just great fun. And for a year, I did nothing but write briefs. I was the second-year associate who would stay up all night and write the briefs and never get to argue anything. But it was great because I would see them in court. And there was a pivotal moment when I think it was Arthur Lyman was in front of Judge Cabranes, I believe, and maybe the GAF Union Carbide takeover or some takeover. And we had written an antitrust defense. I don't even remember which side we were on. And we were about to argue the case, and then Mr. Lyman, he was always Mr. Lyman to me, he stood up and he said, Your Honor, we withdraw our motion or some such. And I looked at him, I said, what, did I write the wrong brief? What did I do wrong? He said, no, a higher bid came in. And so I understood. I said, okay, the moment you get an extra $2 a share, suddenly the antitrust issues disappear into the ether, and suddenly we're all good with it. So it was, so you realize to a certain extent the lawyers are there, were the gears that turned when the corporate deals were getting made. But it was great. I loved it. And then went from there down to the DA's office, where, again, that was more law and order. That was how you see the TV version of being a lawyer, where you're in front of the jury and there's a bad guy and you point your finger and said, he did this and that. Yeah. Hopefully you're right. But that was great.
So, throw the book at him. That's the wrong guy.
Right. Oops. Sorry. Well, one of my friends down there, to his credit, as a lawyer, I'm not sure how the ethics of this play out, is the only person I know who convicted two different people for the same crime. And I said to him, wow, that's, a friend of mine, actually, before I went down to the DA's office, said, you're a good lawyer when you convict somebody who's innocent. I said, I'm not going to go there. He said, no, you won't go there. But that's real skill.
That's a very good point. I'm pretty sure there's a rule against that.
Yeah, I think that's somewhere in the ethics rules. But
somewhere.
So then, how did you end up in the DA's office?
It was actually Arthur Lyman who one day, I think he appreciated that I loved the lawyering, the research, the writing. It was fun, but wanted to be in front of a bit more active, as I think with many younger associates, to the extent that there is actual advocacy in front of a judge or in front of a magistrate, whomever it may be. Usually that's reserved for the more senior people. And so if you're a second-year associate, you're not going to get to stand up in front of the court and actually argue. So I kind of intimated that, and he picked up the phone one day to Robert Morgenthau and said, I have a kid you should hire. And the next week I was down there and had an amazing time. 6 years I began in something called the career criminal unit, where unless you were a recidivist violent felon, you didn't get in front of us. And so we had bad guys. I mean, rap sheets that were lengthy and multiple violent offenders. And my first offense was a Rob 1, which is a B1 felony, and he convicted the guy. It was, but you got the trial work. It was fun. You got to be in front of a jury, make mistakes. Being in front of a jury is scary because suddenly you're on TV, right? Suddenly you're thinking, this is what they do on TV, but they have a script. And you're worried, are they going to object? What am I doing wrong? And they don't really teach you in law school how those rules work. You can take an evidence class, but you don't quite know how it plays out in front of a jury. So it was great. I did a bunch of trials and then went to the Rackets Bureau and did some organized crime cases and some political corruption cases. And it was great. It was fun.
And
challenging.
I can imagine how challenging. I mean, if you were terrified of going into a judge's chambers when you're working for the judge.
Right. But you get over it. I mean, to a certain extent, the mythology and the mysticism of it disappears, right? I mean, part of it is you realize the judge is just an ordinary guy who was a litigator. Well, these days, I hate to say it, I'm 64. So most of the people who are appointed to the federal bench, Southern District, which is considered, at least within the New York world, the preeminent bench in the country.
Yeah.
I knew them when they were punk little kids. And it's like, I can't respect you. Come on. I knew you in the kindergarten class. I mean, this is, so your perspective on all these things changes over time, as it should. There is still respect for the position and the authority of what they're doing, but the reverence for them as individuals dissipates a bit over time.
Yeah, you put them in a pedestal in your head, but once you talk, you see, we're all just people.
Exactly. They're doing their best in a tough position, but they're just like us. So
when you were a prosecutor, you did a lot of these mob cases.
Right. I did one case that was significant. It was related to the garment center, and it took us 3 years to do it. We actually ran a sting operation that was both a trucking company and a sweatshop down in Christie Street. We'll cycle back to real estate later, but it shows you how New York has transformed. We rented a space on Christie Street and set up a sweatshop. It was a sting operation. It was right out of the TV series and had a couple of state troopers running it, and then hired people. The point is, Christie Street then became almost the most valuable real estate in the city. Now you have, I forget the name of the hotel, just went to bankruptcy, which was another cycle. Great hotel that was added there. Sammy's Romanian, the restaurant, used to be down in the basement there, but that's gone. So at the Christie Street, we ran a sweatshop on Christie Street and got the probable cause to prove a combination of antitrust violations and extortions on the part of the Gambino family and the other organized crime families. They all shared control of the garment industry through the trucking companies. And it was a complicated case that was somewhat difficult to present to the jury, but we did it effectively till there was a plea agreement / settlement. And it was fun. Had some great lawyers on the other side, Jerry Shargell, Mike Rosen.
Oh, Jerry passed away a few years ago.
Jerry passed away, sadly. Had a tough couple last years. Charming. He could charm a jury into anything. And that's what worries you. I mean, you see, there's facts and there's emotion. He was spectacular as a trial lawyer. Had a couple cases with him, against him. As charming and smooth and trustworthy. No, that he was not slick. I mean, you don't waste somebody. He's not
what you think of like as a sleazy attorney.
No. And I had lunch with him at Sparks after the Gambino trial. And for those who don't know, Sparks is where Paul Castellano was murdered by John Gotti, which is when Gotti took over the Gambino family. It was I prosecuted Tommy Gambino, who was the son of Carlo, who was, many people say, the Michael Corleone figure in real life out of The Godfather. And I think there's a fair bit of truth to it. Put that aside, sitting there having lunch with Jerry, and he says, do you know what John Gotti told me about Sparks? I said, no, Jerry, what's the punchline? He said, food is great, but parking is murder. I said, okay, let's consider our rules of evidence. Is that admissible as a statement against interest? Is that a confession by John Gotti? So it was.
That's a good evidence hypothetical.
Jerry was a charming and smart lawyer who was meticulous. And as some people thought, got too close to his clients, but he was a great guy.
It's also the nature of the game, right? When you're defending someone who's been criminally charged, you got to be like their psychologist a little bit, right?
I mean, I think that's exactly right. When I was at Skadden, after I left the DA's office and did some white collar defense, being a white collar lawyer, and even more if you're doing traditional criminal law, is as much psychotherapy as anything else. Because
probably more, right?
Probably more. The people charged are in desperate need of some reassurance that life isn't ending. On the other hand, the other end of the spectrum of that is the criminal defense attorney. The verdict comes in and his client is found guilty. His client says to him, so now what? And the lawyer says, you go to jail, I go to lunch. So there is that, that necessary emotional distance you have to keep between yourself and the client, because dispassionate advice depends upon that sense of
objectivity.
Distance. Exactly. Yeah. Which is hard to keep, but important.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's one of a million reasons why I never got into criminal defense. I think it's tough.
Fun. It's challenging because so much does ride on it for your client, more than the dollars and cents of traditional corporate work or even litigation.
It's the exact reason why I went into corporate work.
Right.
Yeah, the stakes are.
I don't need to deal with people's lives like that.
Yeah, you're right.
So is there a reason that you think you left? I mean, it looks like you were there for 6 years in the DA's office. Why would you?
Well, I was chief of the labor racketeering unit. We had a great time, made a bunch of cases that I was proud of. And at the end of that, look, this is 1992. I think I was probably 32 years old or so when I left. And it was either sign on for another large case, which takes 2 or 3 years to make, or move to a next chapter in life. I was married. I think we had 1 or 2, I should know, be able to do the arithmetic, 1 or 2 kids already. And it was ready for a new challenge. So I went off to Skadden to sort of see life is, not to get sort of too philosophical about it.
No, this is what we want to hear.
No, but it's a series of chapters, right? Doing the same thing over and over is not as exciting and interesting as sequentially experiencing different types of professions. There were 1 or 2 where I wish I'd had more time. 1 or 2 where I probably could have stayed less, but it was great.
No, you followed your instincts, your gut. And you knew it was time, you finished up and this is the end of the chapter for you.
Right. It was not by any stretch. I went over on Skadden and then obviously remained as a lawyer when I was AG. It was not disdain or a rejection of lawyering, just the opposite. I love, these are the words you never think you will hear yourself say, because when you're a student in law school, it sounds so hackneyed and so old to say, oh my God, how could someone, but I love the law. It really is a remarkable creation, as it were, that has permitted society to move forward. It's not always right. It evolves, it changes, it's malleable, but it is something separate and apart from other social structuring tools that have existed in history. And it's uniquely important.
And you sort of embodied that as well as the DA to bring that rule of law.
I mean, I used to say when I was Attorney General, and I would do the last, in office, we had 600 lawyers, and I would do the last interview of everybody who would join the office. Usually by then it was something of a formality, unless the more senior positions where I would be significantly involved. But I would say to the lawyers, and I would mean it, there's no greater honor than standing in front of a jury or a judge or any determiner of fact and saying, I represent the people of the state of New York, right? I mean, you're representing, your client is the body politic. It is sort of this notion of you're there, as we said before, about being to do what's right. You're not there for somebody's venal purpose. You're not there for somebody's who's guilty, but you're trying to get them off on a technicality. You're there to represent what is your sense of right and wrong and justice. And it's a remarkable privilege and obligation. And it's a great time.
To go back to your point that we kind of started early on was the way that the political hammer is being used to fulfill certain objectives, MOs that people have. Was that something that you'd experienced where people had came to you and said, I need you to look into this person for whatever motivations? And did you see any of that in your career?
It was in a slightly different context. People in the outside world would come to us and say, a judge must be corrupt because he didn't rule my way. Now, okay, which I would understand.
If I was this election, it must be fraud.
Right. Yeah, precisely. I mean, we abide by the law, and that is the way things get done in the state. And so there are people who don't quite grasp that dichotomy between personal interest and public interest, or personal interest and the rule of law. But I was lucky. I mean, I've been asked over the years, who were the lawyers from whom you learned the most? And it was Arthur Lyman, whose brilliance and just intellectual ferociousness was remarkable. Morgenthau, when he was DA, who embodied this notion of not politics, but the law as applied fairly to everybody. And Judge Sweet, who also, I hope every clerk feels this way about his or her judge, but it was just a year where things were done dispassionately and properly and by the law and for justice.
For me, I still hear my judge in my ear. And when I'm writing, he's speaking to me about what I need to fix and this is at this point, it's like 15 years ago, 16 years ago. So,
well, I remember my judge screaming about the Second Circuit whenever they'd reverse. The way he described them was not the Queen's English, but that's all right. It was, it worked.
I don't think if Brendan and Camilla don't understand, getting reversed is like, for a judge is the worst. So whenever something went on appeal, my judge would be searching for the decision to make sure that there wasn't a reversal.
Although there were one or two times when I would write drafts, which he wanted to go a certain way, and I would say, Judge, you know they're going to reverse us on this, because he would say, I don't care. Some invectives would flow, but he would say, this is the way it should go. And more often than not, he was right. Even if we only got reversed a couple of times, but it was we knew it was coming.
So you move from prosecuting cases to white collar crime. What transitions you into running for attorney general?
It was, I think, as much as I enjoyed my time at Skadden, great colleagues, clients had interesting issues to deal with. The appeal of representing the public was very real. And it was not politics as such. I mean, even though it's an elective position in New York, it's not elective in every state, because I'm not inherently at some level good in that type of politics. But I said, I want to be a lawyer. Being AG would be remarkable. And I actually thought it was an underutilized office. The jurisdiction that vested in the office was enormous. And the capacity to bring the cases, whether it's environmental cases or labor cases, civil rights cases, in addition to doing your statutory duty of representing the state defensively, was just very exciting to me. And so I'd like to think that in the years I was there, bringing in some of the most superb litigators in the state, we did expand that jurisdiction and brought, not only the Wall Street cases that everybody sort of seemed to hear about because money is still money, and it got all the attention, 60 Minutes and all the rest, but in a way, the most emotionally satisfying cases to me were the labor cases, where we represented, the delivery guys who were delivering food for the supermarkets, but were not being paid even minimum wage, or workers who at the restaurants, you go into it sounds not silly, but the workers at the restaurants in the bathrooms where there are those little tip jars, though that money was being taken from them and they weren't being paid minimum wage. And cases like that have a genuine human impact. And then so it was as emotionally rewarding job as I can imagine as a lawyer.
And how did you figure out what to focus on? There are lots of issues that you could be attacking. I know the financial stuff has been, the focus, really. If you look at the headlines, that's really, but how did you decide, well, labor or financial crimes, this is what I want people to go after?
Well, it was all of the above. Notice we had bureaus. They were tiny. And to come back to finance for a second, we had, I think, 6 lawyers in our Investor Protection Bureau, compared to the SEC that has 3,000 lawyers. And so when people would say, oh, well, the SEC routinely would look at us and get angry because we were way ahead of them every time. And they would always go to Congress and say, give us more lawyers. And I'd say, no, you have it backwards. You have too many lawyers. When you have very few resources, you have to say, how do I use them most effectively? And I was fortunate in having spectacular bureau chiefs. Eric Donalo, who was the first bureau chief, I had known him in the DA's office and at Paul Weiss, I believe, and persuaded him to come over as the bureau chief. And he and then us together came up with the analyst cases. But I said to my bureau chiefs, your job is to be as creative as you can possibly be. If I have to say no, I'll be the one who says no. But you come to me with all the possible creativity. Peter Lehner in the Environmental Bureau, who brought the coal cases, a spectacular lawyer, came from the NRDC, had been a very senior lawyer there, now is at Earth Justice, is one of those lawyers who sees around the corner and sees problems where others don't, or, interestingly, in the case of the analysts, saw a problem that people might have understood but were afraid to stand up and articulate. So in other words, there was a willingness just to do stuff that other people were afraid of. And I mean, I'll tell you the story. The first analyst case where, I won't bore you with the underlying fact patterns, but analysts were lying on Wall Street. Shocking, right? They were getting people to buy stuff that was junk. The lawyers for Merrill Lynch came into the office, and the sorts of arguments that defense lawyers make are, A, you misunderstand the facts. B, you've taken it out of context. C, the employee is a rogue, so you can't blame us for everything that's going on. They didn't do any of that. They sat in my office and they looked me in the eye and they said, you're right about all the facts. And these are the lawyers from Merrill Lynch. They said, but we're not as bad as Goldman Sachs. That was their defense. That was their defense. Honest to God. And I said, I just looked at him in amazement and I said, wow, I prosecuted a lot of people. And when I was prosecuting a guy for 5 robberies, he didn't put up his hand and say, I did all 5, but the guy over there did 10. It doesn't matter. This isn't this isn't like a moral relativism case where they're worse. And so, but so one thing led to another. And we were aggressive enough, creative enough, and understood that we had to use our resources. So we worked hard.
And how did that information come to you? Did somebody come with a complaint? Did you just...
Sometimes you just need to understand what's going on in the world. And I give a lot of credit to Eric Donalo, David Brown, who succeeded him as the Bureau Chief of Investor Protection, who had been a law school classmate at Harvard, and that he had been, I forget where he'd practiced, he was at Goldman at the time, so he understood Wall Street. You need people who understand the area that they're practicing in and know where, I hate the phrase where the skeleton's buried because it suggests maybe more than there is, but understand what the dynamics are so they can say, here's what we should do. And so, or Peter Lehner from the NRDC, who had the creativity to say, here's how we sue the coal companies in the Midwest. And I remember, I had an interchange with, I forget the senator, I was testifying in Congress, and we were suing the utilities in Ohio. And for the emissions that went up to the air, the nitrous oxide, the sulfur dioxide, all the rest that came down. And he said to me with this very senatorial tone, they're doing that in Ohio. Why are you suing them in New York? And I said, Senator, with all due respect, they come out of very tall smokestacks. And they built those very tall smokestacks in Ohio to make sure that those emissions didn't come down in Ohio. They didn't even come down in New Jersey. New Jersey's New Jersey. We probably wouldn't care, right? It's polluted anyway. But it came down in my state of New York. And I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to sue you. And that's what we're here to do. And we won. And we got them to put the scrubbers on their emissions and then begin to enforce all the environmental rules that the EPA had properly promulgated. And that was early on in this effort. But that's how things happen.
That's brilliant. How do you figure out that the smoke is actually traveling?
Look, every time you get an airplane, the wind's going this way, you're going that way. You say, this was science is part of these environmental cases. And unless you're a Luddite, unless somebody or part of the Republican Party that doesn't believe in science, not to be partisan, but science matters. And so people in certain areas of the law have to understand the science, have to understand the math, the arithmetic. And then at a certain point, we also got whistleblowers on Wall Street in particular.
Yep.
And there were some whistleblowers, one from Goldman who came in that triggered all what we call the mutual fund cases about late trading and this and that. And when she walked in the door, told the story, Noreen Harrington was her name. I haven't thought about her in a long time. It was like, wow, that can't be true. But it was true. Everything she said, absolutely true. And it was just kind of startling that this stuff was going on. And there it is.
No, I think it's very sophisticated, very complicated. And it's a good thing you had a good team that understood the stuff.
I was the luckiest guy. I mean, I cut a very fair deal with all the lawyers in my office. They would work hard. I would get all the credit. And it was
very fair deal.
Sounds familiar.
It's like being a partner in a law firm, right? No, it was.
I absolutely love it, Ali. I'm not going to lie to you. This is going to be my new motto.
It was. Look, I like to think I worked hard enough so they respected my lawyering skills and our sense of strategy and how to move things forward. But having a team and these things it's stating the obvious, but it's the core to everything.
Yeah.
Did you
have a great team too, by the way? I wanted to compliment you before you.
Well, thank you.
I know how important it is to have a good team.
Later today, David will be like, where's my credit?
Right. Yeah. We'll give him credit on the deals.
Remember when things go bad, who gets in trouble? Right?
Well, that's true. There is that element also. When you're at the top, you get the incoming missiles and the attacks, which is part of the game.
Yeah.
And that's part of the role.
So after you're attorney general, you run for governor.
Right.
You win by the largest margin of any candidate.
Right.
Did you bring any of your team with you to the governor's office? Like you clearly have such a love for them.
Yes. I mean, it's an interesting, I remember sitting down and looking at the various roles within the executive branch. And frankly, not many of them translate well to pure litigators in the sense that the AG's office has the lawyers for a reason. What was more important in the executive branch was managerial skills. Now, David Decenti, who was a spectacular lawyer, had been my counsel in the AG's office. He came with me as counsel. Eric Donalo, who had left after 4 years, had gone to Debevoise after his 4 years as head of the Investor Protection Bureau, came back and came to the state as superintendent of insurance. And so in other words, you tried to find the fit. David Brown, I think, was the head of the dormitory authority. And I remember calling him and said, David, I have a great job for you. He said, what is it? I said, you're going to be head of the dormitory authority. There's a long pause. And he said, what does this possibly have to do with any skill set that I have? He's thinking people sweeping out the dorms and this and that, right? Being responsible for the maintenance of the dorms at the SUNY system. The dormitory authority was, back then, I don't know if it still is, the largest issuer of bonds in the state and maybe it was one of these entities that was the financial conduit for virtually all the state agencies. And so it was really one of the most critical financial roles in the state. So once we got over that hurdle, we said, okay, that was great.
Provided that little bit of clarification.
Right. So you try to find the right job for the right people. And, again, it's not always easy, but you try your best.
What was your, the thing that motivated you to want to run for governor? Because I guess, yes, you were the attorney general, which is a very high profile. But then the governor is that's basically like the president of New York.
Well, look, I mean, to the extent that any of us has that sense of ambition, I don't know how it became a dirty word or not, a word laced with some negativism. We all have it, or I had it. And I said, okay, this is the next logical step. That was what was presumed. The jurisdiction is larger, the individual, and hence the appeal of the office. And you're dealing with a broader range of issues, even if, and here's the interesting part, your individual capacity to effectuate change may be less in the sense that the attorney general is a unitary decision maker. You bring the case, you don't bring the case. You can put your facts together, you get in front of a fact finder, you get a remedy. As the governor, you have the legislature, obviously. You have executive agencies that have authority, which is very substantial, but usually bounded by commissions and regs and other factors. And so it's a job where you begin with huge ideas and find that it's harder than you might hope to effectuate change. I mean, one of the things that we finally got done, let's say the obvious, I was only not there as long as I wanted to, resigned after a year and a bit, which obviously was not an easy thing. It was difficult at many levels, but we did get funding for the Second Avenue subway, which was in the budget in 07. It took a lot of work with a lot of different people. It had been an idea on the books for 100 years.
It's my favorite subway, I'll tell you.
Yeah, it turned out well.
I use it every day.
It is great.
And it just completed recently, right?
Recently.
Yeah.
Is that
It
a
took 10 years.
favorite subway?
Yeah. The queue is gorgeous.
It is.
Gorgeous. Yeah.
And look, a lot of people deserve a lot of credit, but we actually said, this is a mission. We got the money in the budget. So transportation is one of the areas that a governor has outsized sway because capital expenditures in the budget you can push pretty aggressively. And to come back to real estate for a moment, transportation dictates real estate values. And the renaissance, I would say, on Second Avenue on the Upper East Side is to a great extent because you can get on that Q train and get to Hudson Yards, you can get to wherever you need to get, not wherever, but it created a pivotal link. And so permitting transportation to work in the city is something that governors, and I'll give Mike Bloomberg a lot of credit for the 7 line. The 7 line also was hugely important to stop. So people understand that transportation is not, if not the lifeblood, that maybe overstates it, but it's critical. It's like the arteries of urban life.
Was there anything pushing you in that direction? Like you said, people gave you information or you researched. How did that come to be an issue? How did you learn about this?
Look, you read about the Teddy Roosevelt or FDR or these other people who are sort of iconic governors in New York, and you say, those are the people who are transformative. Those are the people who brought some intellectual heft to the position and were not simply caretakers. And, there have been chapters in politics where being a caretaker was either sufficient or what was expected. There are also moments when being creative is what is expected and important because we need transformation of some sort.
It's, just sort of the status quo and just riding it out versus innovating and bringing some sort of change, whether it's immediate or 10 years later.
Or seeing the changes is occurring and how do we adapt to it, right? I mean, nothing is static. I mean, as I say, there are no straight lines in history. Things are always changing and moving in a different direction. Trying to understand what those directions are and get ahead of the problem, or at least begin to deal with it, is what governance should be all about.
And what was the dynamic between you and your people as opposed to the legislature? Maybe you can
juxtapose it to what's occurring now?
I'd say between the governor and the legislature, I'm not sure if it's a knife fight or a bullfight or what. If you gave executives truth serum, a governor or a president talking about the Congress, I don't think the first temptation is to say positive things about the legislative branch. It just intuitively somehow an executive may want to do all sorts of things, and legislative bodies, by their nature, are slower in their decision process. It takes years to create the coalition. There are, in my case, when I was up in Albany, we had Republican control of the Senate, Democratic control of the Assembly, and hence could not get agreement on issues that I would have thought should have been, bridgeable. And yet, politics being what it is, you end up with these static positions, and it's difficult. So you have the sense of stagnation that takes over in legislative bodies, where you see the same battle being fought year after year, and you just say, "Come on, guys, this is not helping anybody." But so look, but you have to work with them. You have to try to figure things out, and there it is.
And do you have any? And I'm assuming you're following some of what's going on with the current governor. Maybe you were facing some issues in terms of housing, how to resolve those issues. We're always facing a crisis, an affordable housing crisis, and a housing crisis. What would you do that she's not?
Well, I don't want to try to give her advice. I mean, I would say this: she has a different structural problem than I did. When I was governor, as I said, I had a Republican Senate and a Democratic Assembly, and so you had something of an ideological battle there, and couldn't get a whole lot done on certain issues. Governor Hochul has Democratic control of both houses, but I think it's fair to say the progressive wing of the Democratic Party has been flexing its muscles in a way that has put her in the position of trying to forestall some of the ideas that I think most of us who are now in the real estate business, or most people who would look at economics and urban growth and housing policy, would think will not lead to this type of housing policies that we need. And I think the progressives, well-intentioned, I think they misunderstand the markets and misunderstand how to encourage the markets to build what we need. So I think she has been playing some defense, tried to get some zoning ideas through last year that were difficult. Local communities are not likely to give up their capacity to control upzoning, even if you're saying it's only near the train stations. Her concept is right. I mean, her concept of, again, it comes back to transportation. Her concept that you use transportation nodes and say that is where we can build more housing, even outside major urban areas. But we've all seen, NIMBYism is a fact of life, and local opposition to upzoning is real, and upzoning is the answer. And so you need to figure out, how do we get communities here in New York City, as well as out in suburban communities, to upzone, to permit more housing to be built? Because we have had for 70 years a structural housing shortage. And the answer for politicians has been price controls, because that mollifies tenants. But what that doesn't do is encourage new housing. And yet we would have been better off, if you go back 70 years, somehow encouraging the production of housing. It would have created more housing, been better for the economy. And interestingly, the losers probably would have been landlords, because right now we own a scarce resource. In other words, we are benefiting, even with rent control, from the reality that what we own is desired by more people that can afford it. And so the rent structure has created the scarcity that benefits those of us who actually own it, even though I think it's a bad policy in many respects. But that's the odd conundrum that we're facing.
It's sort of a game of housing chicken, right? Who's going to blink first? Because I think you're right. I think the Democrats are more like 2 or 3 parties almost at this point.
Well, they don't know. I think there's ambiguity about who they are and who they want to be. There's no question that Mike Gianaris, as the leader of the progressive wing of the party, is making a lot of the decisions on housing, and has, I think, taken positions that I disagree with. I used to deal with Mike on a regular basis, liked him. I think he's been fundamentally wrong. For instance, his opposition to Amazon coming to New York was just kind of shocking. A couple thousand jobs, a couple 100,000 square feet at least of office space, a company that's paying good wages. What's wrong with that?
Right.
But then they find out all the subsidies and everybody goes up. That becomes the headline.
But even there, the subsidies were only out of the future tax they were going to be generating. But no deal like that will ever be perfect. But it was certainly, if you believe in economic growth, and we need upzoning. We need more housing. We need not to have our local elected officials object to every opportunity to have something built on the notion that it's going to lead to gentrification. What does gentrification mean? It means people are moving in to new housing. Yes, it may be more expensive. Maybe you get some inclusionary housing with it, but that's progress. I mean, that is the dynamic of urban growth. Otherwise,
that ripples out also. The more supply that you have will affect
Absolutely.
rents later.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the only thing that will bring pricing down in the long run.
Right.
Is building tens of thousands of new units that will permit the market to finally reach an equilibrium at a fair price.
Totally.
So the governor has done something which I think is interesting, not because it brings back 421A in some form, but because it's a statement to the legislature. If I can't work with you, I'm going to go around you.
Right.
I don't know if it's going to work.
With Gowanus. Well, we'll see if it works. I hope it does. And I think it's clever and it's good. I'm not saying this, what I'm about to say is a criticism. I don't think it is a sufficient answer to the larger problem, because I think you can only do that in a certain limited number of contexts. But I give her a lot of credit for trying to ensure, in particular with those 421A projects that have begun, that they get to completion. I mean, there is something somewhat insane about saying to people who bought with the presumption of 421A are doing what is right to move their projects forward. The delay is inherent in construction, especially in an urban context like New York. Maybe they won't hit that deadline, but then to throw the project out, there's just you almost wonder what are they thinking in the legislature when they don't permit that to move forward. But the answer is, what they're saying is, I have a negotiating position. Everything in life is getting a negotiating position, and they're saying, if you want that, I've got to get X, Y, or Z, whether it's good cause, whether it is some other unrelated issue. It could be something related to transportation, could be education, but everything gets wound up into one ball of wax, and it makes crafting the deal complicated. But so we'll see what happens.
No, I agree. It's a negotiating chip. And what I'm interested in hearing from you, if you have some sort of opinion, is, do you think that move was correct? Not because she's trying to save those 421A projects, but because she's sending a message. I think it's
absolutely. Yeah, well, absolutely. You have to be, in any negotiation, you need to be tough enough to look at the other side and say, either I can just say no and walk away, or I can do without you.
Right.
And what she's basically saying is, I can do this without you, which is the most terrifying thing for the legislative body. The one thing a legislator hates to be is irrelevant, right? They don't want to be in a position where if they stand up and say, I'm going to put out a press release saying this, that, or the other thing, people say, we don't care, right? Because you're no longer part of that decision process. So that's why everybody wants to be at the table. Right? That's where the cliche comes from. I'm at the table. I'm part of the process. If you figure out a way to make them irrelevant, then you actually are outmaneuvering them in the most important negotiation.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way of putting it.
Yeah, no, I give her look. I hope that there are larger resolutions reached the next couple months into next year on housing that would promote the sort of housing. I mean, look, the amount of capital. Look, we're at an odd economic moment right now with interest rates being where they are. Things are obviously more complicated. Commercial real estate is in a rather dicey position, but presuming that somehow those are transitory issues, even if there's a new normal with interest rates, and we'll see where it is, there has to be some larger consensus reached about how we get private capital to flow into the creation of residential housing, because that is what the city needs.
Yeah.
And I think it's hard in this environment. I agree, to get that.
So you join your father's business, the Spitzer Enterprises, and you're rebranding.
Spitzer Engineering.
Well, he was
Spitzer Engineering.
He used to be Spitzer Engineering. He was, look, not to, my dad grew tired of it when I was out in campaign. He said, I don't want to hear about my story anymore. But he is one of those great New York stories. He was born here in 24, first member of the family born here, and went to Townsend Harris, which was the combination of Stuyvesant and Bronx High School of Science together at the time, CCNY. And was in the Navy, and then got an engineering degree from Columbia, and worked for a couple of the Minskoff family, and then went off on his own and began to build a few buildings, and he did well. And it was he was the entrepreneur. He took the risk, began by building up on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, and then up in Riverdale, and then 1050 Fifth Avenue. And so he progressed.
He built like 15 or 16 buildings.
He did. I should know the exact number, but yeah, no, he did.
That's
well.
why we're here.
And some of them were large. The Corinthian at 38th and First, which was at the time, I think, the largest single residential building that had been built. I mean, there are other complexes, obviously Co-op City and Lefrak City, that were bigger, but as an individual building, I think it may have been the largest individual residential building. So yeah, it was great.
So that was a natural step for you after you left the office?
Look, my life was a little bit unsettled at that point, obviously, and it was difficult. I'd always been extremely close with my dad. I think I had followed the business and I don't say understood it. Until you're part of something, you don't understand it, but I'd always talked business and economics with him. And I think part of my understanding of macroeconomics came from that. So I joined the business with him, and he was, we had fun for the number of years that he was there. He had Parkinson's in the last couple of years, which is tough if anybody's ever, any one of these degenerative diseases is. But then since we have been trying to continue the tradition of essentially building primarily with our own capital, choice residential spots. We do not do commercial office buildings, glad to say. Well, we have one. We have one in a great building in Washington, D.C., more complicated story, beautiful building that we're partners.
What brought you to DC in the first place? How did you?
It was an acquisition. We bought 2001 K Street, which was a handsome building and a good standalone office building on K Street, which is the Park Avenue of Washington, D.C., had great tenant base. And then we partnered with Rockrose, Henry L. Gagnon, who came to us and said, look, if we buy 2000 L Street, which was the adjoining property, do a zoning lot merger, we can get additional FAR on the 2000 L piece of the property. And not quite technically do a tear down of the 2000 L. We kind of did a rehab in place, which was very complicated. In retrospect, tear down might have been easier, but put that aside, and ended up with essentially an 800,000 square foot office building that I think I'll puff out my chest and say is the best office building in the city.
You should.
It is beautiful. It's exquisite, both aesthetically. We have great tenants. Paul Weiss is one of the tenants, so I like to say that I've gone full circle with them. I was a summer associate. I was an associate. Now they're landlord. So it all works out very well.
So the partnership with the Rockrose was sort of, they were just on the other lot, and so it just made sense to work on it together?
Yes. The other layer of that is my dad and Henry had been friends, and Henry is just a wonderful, charming individual whom I had gotten to know. He's a bit older than I am. He has a son, Justin, who's a bit younger than I am. So it was kind of like, there was just a synergy there that was great. And this is the first time we ever partnered together. But so that is the only office. Well, we have another one in Bethesda that's owned by the trust.
So I've seen that you partnered with Al Gagnon in DC, but you sold a bunch of properties in Hudson Yards to Related. What's your methodology?
We bought
keeping a partner versus selling to a partner?
We're still partners with Related in 451 10th Avenue. What happened there was I acquired, this was some 1031 money, acquired, I'd say about 2/3 of a city block between 35th, 36th, 10th and the Hudson Boulevard Park.
Right.
And because of the zoning that was mandated by the city, there was permissible construction of one residential piece and then a 1 million square foot office building on essentially most of the remainder of the block. There's a tiny corner that we didn't get. And Related is the natural partner there because they have built Hudson Yards and done a spectacular job. I give enormous credit to Related, to their leadership. It wasn't easy, and a lot of people were critical, as people always are, of the aesthetics
people
and
are
this
always
and that.
critical.
But you know what? They've built a new city there.
It's transformative. It's a totally different area.
Transformative.
Yeah.
Built. I mean, you look at the tenant list they have there, from KKR to CNN to just on and on, is remarkable. Hats off to them. But what happened was I looked at the commercial piece, which we were then going to pair with the commercial piece that they had on that block. And frankly, the commercial, and this judgment I made about a couple of years ago, I said, you know what, that requires a depth, I want to say maybe a capital depth that you need to be Related with many outside partners who can provide the capital and the staying power. I said, we're a family business. Better to sell that to them and to stick to the residential piece where we're 50-50 and with some pref equity up top, put that aside. And a beautiful building. They basically took the lead on the construction. We were in the middle of some other projects, and they've done a great job. So hats off to them and to Jeff Blau and to the people there who were really good.
Yeah, I mean, you can't, like I said, you can't go a day without seeing something about Related also in the
They're
papers.
a machine, and I say that in a positive way. I mean, they really are. They know how to get things built on budget, on time, even through COVID, and it was very impressive.
Yeah, it's a tough business.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Look, people out there in the real world, people have asked me, which is harder, politics or real estate or this or that. And of course, they're all difficult in their own way, right? There is no common metric to judge any of this. But in a way, getting a building built is about as difficult as anything you can undertake, right? I mean, the logistics, the timing, the finance, the legal, the local politics, there are so many facets to it that it really is Rubik's Cube.
So one of those projects that you've actually gone through the whole process with is 416 and 420 Kent.
And wait, this is what you said about 420 Kent, 416 Kent. We wanted to build something that wasn't just a rectangle. Having a certain pride in contributing to the skyline is part of the joy of doing this.
One of my favorite things about this podcast is dropping the name of the podcast in the podcast. So Eliot Spitzer here is shaping the New York City skyline.
That's right.
We tried. And look, let me give credit where credit is due. Aran Chen of ODA is the architect. And we had piece of clay was the land, which is this remarkably situated, at the time we bought it, parking lot on the Williamsburg waterfront with these vistas of Manhattan. And what will market the project probably is the view out. But you care about also is what it will look like when you're outside looking at it. And Aran came up with these beautiful, I think, 3 towers, cantilevers, interesting ins and outs, a curtain wall that is both reflective and clever and different. And I just think it is really quite stunning.
It is. I've seen the view, by the way, from driving from the the Williamsburg Bridge into Brooklyn.
Right.
Seen the buildings because they are very prominent, and also taking the ferry from Dumbo to Williamsburg.
Right.
And they're gorgeous, especially when sort of the sun is
when the sun
setting.
is setting, it's reflecting off the glass.
Oh my God. The sun is setting is ridiculous. It's so
really
beautiful.
Is and Aran deserves the credit for that. And the only thing I did was say yes. And, which sometimes
kind of like my wife.
Add the money.
Which isn't always easy to do because the curtain wall is expensive and the cantilevers are expensive. But it was great fun both to build. It's big, 857 units. It was a complicated process. Building on the water is difficult. You have the water flowing in through the seawall. We had a dewatering system. I forget the numbers, how many thousands of gallons a minute. We had to pump out back into the river, filtered because of the environmental issues. And so it's complicated. But at the end of the day, I think it's an accomplishment.
It really is.
So,
and it's mixed income. So you're providing both like a wide range of tenants. It's really amazing.
No, it's in addition to the community. Williamsburg, look, and huge amount of credit goes to 2 trees, the Walentis family, for seeing what Williamsburg could be. And they have done well, and deservedly so. They bought a lot of that waterfront and have built many of those projects and created the sort of urban lifestyle that keeps New York what it is.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful project as well.
Yeah.
I'm noticing you dole out a lot of credit.
Yeah,
I feel like you should take some of the credit
I don't
too.
need it anymore. I've had my share.
So you bought these properties, which they were parking lot, but they were vacant.
Right.
What was the intention there? Was there an intention to do something like this?
Oh, yeah. We looked at it. We don't buy land to store it. We buy land with an intent to begin as quickly as we can because the carrying costs are significant. And as I said, we're a family business primarily using our capital that's generated internally. And so we don't want to sit around for 5 years paying the carry costs.
Of course.
And so in fact, with that property, we had the other interesting and agonizing piece of it was that we had a 128 deadline. I think we closed in February. We needed to have footings in the ground by June.
Mm-hmm.
And we had signed the contract, I believe, back in September. So we had a slightly longer runway to get ready, to get plans through DOB and get the footings in. And we made it by, I think, 12 hours. And it was, when you're getting close, but it was tight. And so we had
But you did it.
We did it. We had to get the footings in. And that was part of the excitement.
It's always interesting. Keeping you on your toes.
That's Indiana Jonesing it, by the way. That's what Indiana Jonesing it is.
Oh, you're right.
You know, in Indiana Jones, where he
Jonesing it.
always slides under some sort of falling door, he drops his hat, grabs his hat last minute.
Right. That's it.
That's
exactly what it is. How did this opportunity come to you, or are you scoping it?
No, it was like many things in life, pure fortuity. Broker whom we didn't know, I think Charles Marisi in my office, who's been a colleague of ours in the office for 35 years, great lawyer, engineer, really a great builder. He got a call one day from a broker and said, "Are you interested in this piece of property?" Ran, as with many things, the back of the envelope calculations are about as accurate as anything you get from a 10-page pro forma, which assumes 85 things that turn out to be wrong. So we did a back of the envelope calculation and said we'd pay X for it. X was what the owner was asking. And so we took a very interesting and creative negotiating position. We called him up and we said yes. And that was it. the
I
idea.
hope all your future deals go as smoothly as that.
it was. We actually didn't think it would happen because we said he should put it up for auction. There should be public bidding. We said yes to his number. And whenever he asked for something else, we'd make him sweat. We waited 5 minutes and then we'd call back and say yes. And it closed. The deal closed. It was, I wouldn't say to our amazement, but it was one of those things where you say, is this really going to happen? It closed. And then it was get out the shovels immediately. We had to do some work.
How did you get ODA involved? Were you?
We spoke to 3 or 4 different architectural firms. And there were really 2 lines of inquiry. 1, what can you do that's creative? And 2, can you get it done in time? And Ron gave us something beautiful and said he could get it done. He now confesses he had absolutely no confidence he could get it done, but that's all right. It's kind of
Fake
like
it till you make it.
It's kind of like in Hunting for Red October when at the end when who was the general asks Alec Baldwin, who has said with absolute certainty that the Russian general is going to turn left. And he said, how did you know he's going to turn left? He said, I had no idea. But I figured it was a 50-50.
Yeah.
If you instill confidence in people, they will follow you. If not,
Exactly.
they're
He
dead.
said, I had to pretend. So,
Yeah.
so
I think that's a mark of a good leader, by the way.
well, unless your bluff fails, but then it's
Depends on
okay.
the consequences, right?
Then you blame
Right.
your boss.
Right.
And then you turn into a lesson.
Right.
Your dad obviously was a very big influence on you. And we've had a couple of other people in the development community whose fathers similarly were very
Right.
important to them and influenced them. And there was one story that I thought was very interesting when I was doing some research here about Monopoly, when you played Monopoly as a kid. And first of all, I want to know if it's true.
That made it to Wikipedia? Wow.
Is it? Not on your page, though, on your dad's page.
Okay.
Oh.
And it said that your dad, when you were about 7 or 8 years old, he would get you to sell him property, which later you could not afford or he could not afford.
Well, he foreclosed on me. And that was,
So you're used to it then, is what you're saying.
no, it hasn't happened to me since.
Oh, is it the first and only time?
Exactly.
Okay, you were
No,
7 or 8.
In the
it's
real
fine.
world,
Right.
it's never happened. But he was, I don't want to say he was strict, which kind of has certain connotation. I mean, it's probably true. He had a great sense of humor, but he also believed in teaching the consequences of certain actions. And you leverage too much and you buy too many hotels on real estate, and then you land on Boardwalk, but he has a hotel, you're in trouble, right?
My dad's the same way.
He understood that the lesson should be too much leverage is dangerous. And when you're foreclosed on by your dad in a game of Monopoly and run away in tears at the age of 7, you don't
It's a
forget.
traumatic experience.
Right? You don't forget. So it worked.
Well, this must have been something that was either traumatic or that definitely stuck in your mind
Both,
because
or
you
both,
remember it.
It's a core memory.
Exactly. It worked, but it worked.
What advice can you offer to the development community in these trying times?
Gosh, I don't know if I'm one to offer advice. I would say, be careful in the sense that these are the moments when, to quote Warren Buffett, when the tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked. And there is sort of the need to be careful in terms of one's capital structure, building on budget and on time, because people who get caught with lengthy delays that are expensive, as we all know, and then have to refinance at a moment when rates are high, bad things happen. On the other hand, being optimistic is also critical because none of us would be here if we didn't ultimately believe that when you look out this window and you see Park Avenue is still Park Avenue. And this is still the center of the universe in terms of things that matter.
And, now I know you're working on another project. I'm not sure, a lot of things are up in the air. I'm not sure how much you want to get into it. We can if you want to, and it'll be the last point that I want to touch upon. But you clearly have confidence in, obviously, your company, New York City, and you're still building. You're here, still building.
Absolutely. I mean, the project you're talking about is, we have a couple things in gestation, but the one that is more public because we just got approval from the Landmarks Commission 2 weeks ago now to rebuild 985 Fifth Avenue, where my dad had built a property back in the late 60s. And it was not, in hindsight, is architecturally as meritorious as one would want for a Fifth Avenue spot. But on the other hand, back then, when the realities of the world were very different as well. So the intent is to tear down an existing rental structure and replace it with something that is, I think, appropriate for the Fifth Avenue from an aesthetic point of view, in terms of the quality of the apartments. It will be quite something.
And why was the decision made not to just buy another vacant land versus just looking at what you already have and just changing it?
Well, I don't think there's anything quite as good as that piece of land. I think it
that's
is
prime
arguably
location.
It is arguably one of the very, very best pieces of property in the city of New York. And if we do it properly, it will be one of the great residential sites in the city.
And the landmarks process, just to explain to the listeners, why is it you had to undergo it and how did that transpire?
The building that is there now is not itself landmarked, just the opposite. It was deemed to be a non-contributory building, meaning it did not add anything of value aesthetically, but it is within a landmark district, which gives the Landmark Preservation Commission jurisdiction and requires that you obtain their approval in order to build something within that district. And so we needed to appear before them. There were 2 questions technically. One was the building we were going to tear down non-contributory, so we could tear it down. And 2 was the design that we proffered to them sufficiently attractive to obtain their approval. And the answers were the ones we desired and appropriate. The design is, again, I think it is not dramatic because most of what you would want on Fifth Avenue fits within the parameters of a certain architectural style, but it is beautifully done. And Bill Sofield and Slice are the sort of creative piece behind it. And it's when it's done, which will be a couple of years from now, still many steps between here and there, it is going to be quite beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to seeing it. Yeah.
Yeah, and hopefully somebody will want to live there. So
I'm sure you're going to have a lot of people.
Are there, obviously there are things in the newspapers that I don't want to get into or for you to comment on, but is there something that you can talk about, any of the complications that you see ahead for this project, for it to completely go forward?
Well, it's time. I think we have to be patient. I mean, it is, we have, and we're very proud of the building we have there right now. It's an occupied rental building. People live there, their homes. Obviously, the process of obtaining possession in its entirety of the whole building is something that the law has a process you have to go through for that, and we will do that. And, it will take some time and some sensitivity, and not everybody is always happy when they're not getting a lease extension, and I understand that. That's the nature of creating a new urban environment.
I think patience is a good virtue to have in terms of real estate.
I've always said patience is a virtue. It's not mine.
Right.
But it is,
One of the things that you said you learned from your father, I think this was a Real Deal article several years ago, is patience and selectivity.
Right.
That's what you learned from your dad.
He was, and I think part of the benefit to being a family business without a huge reservoir of outside capital that has to be deployed on a regular basis is that he was much more selective in where he would build. And as a consequence, he built 5 buildings around Central Park, 1050 5th, 985 5th, 800 5th, 200 Central Park South, and 210 Central Park South. I don't think anybody has built 5 buildings on the park. And he understood that Central Park was a magnet. It was the emotional center of Manhattan. Still is. And the view of the park, it's like an oasis. When you wake up in the morning and see it, it's something special.
Yeah. And your dad was an engineer, which explains his patience. Those people are methodical.
Yep.
And I'm sure you learned a ton from him.
Yep.
Yeah.
Ali, we've taken up a ton of your time. You've given us so much. I want to make sure that you have time to say anything that you think you want to say or you want to promote.
Just thank you. New York City it always feels as though we're at a fraught moment, right? At every moment, people think we're teetering on disaster and about to fall into the abyss. And yet there is a regenerative capacity to the city that is very real and wonderful, but it requires both the patience and the optimism and the tolerance, which is not always there when people disagree. So hopefully we can work our way through that and come back to those easy days when crime is low, the economy is booming, theaters are full, restaurants are busy, and everybody's employed.
I think with more people like you in the city who are contributing and who are fearless and who have good judgment, it'll happen.
We'll get there.
Why don't you tell everybody where they can find you on social media or your website if anybody wants to reach out?
Social media, of course.
I don't have any of that.
None of it.
By the way, every single person we've asked so far on this podcast doesn't do any social media.
I'm too old.
You never know. You never know.
And 2,
60 is the new 50.
60s, well, all right. I'm still too old. There was a chapter in my life when obviously everything was very public and out there. Now it's, I miss it. I miss that, obviously, certain aspects of it, but thrilled to be where I am. So,
and we're thrilled that you are where you are, because otherwise you wouldn't be on our podcast.
Exactly.
We appreciate you coming in.
And we appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure, guys.
Well, everyone, that's our show. Thanks so much for listening.
And of course, don't forget to subscribe. Also, don't forget to leave comments, because we love to hear from our audience, right, Brenda?
Yeah, feel free to reach out at info@sideandshine.com or visit our website at sideandshine.com. We really look forward to hearing from you.
You could also reach out to David and Brenda at dshamshovich@sideandshine.com and bslakowski@sideandshine.com.
those are lengthy last names. You can just find us on our website.
That's right.